My friends, welcome this evening to George Fox. Is that on? Is it off? It's on. Okay, good. You just toned it down. So good to have you. Welcome to George Fox this evening. I'm Joseph Clare. I'm the Dean of Christian Studies in the Honors Program, and this is our latest installment of the William Penn Honors Program lecture series with Noah Toly, who I'll introduce properly in a second. But just to say, our goal is to have a continuous stream of speakers and practitioners who help us reflect on how Christian truth connects and intersects with all areas of life, all areas of culture, all areas of modern society. And increasingly, as we live in divided political times, I think it's really important to have these places where we can reflect on how faith touches every area of our lives. And interacting with you is what I love most in these. So please feel free to have questions after the presentation. A couple updates on other lectures that are coming up. We have Bo Karen Lee from Princeton Seminary is going to be talking about Hildegard of Bingen, the great medieval woman mystic and musician and doctor from the Middle Ages. She'll be here in March. And then we really have one I'm excited about. Nancy Piercy is here April 2nd, and she's going to be talking about her book, Love Thy Body, how Christians can think about the body and sexuality and marriage. And a really important time for us to engage that conversation on this campus, too. So I hope you'll join us that Thursday evening, April 2nd. And this Monday night, not our lecture series, but the Dalton lecture series over in Bauman on Monday night has Ian Hutchinson from MIT. Will be talking about the story of faith and science, and that will be excellent as well. So please join us for all of those things. At the heart of this lecture series is a chance for us to let you know about the mission of George Fox, which has been a Christian liberal arts college since 1891, a place where we do think about how Christ is the center of everything and how that impacts all of our learning and our way in the world. And the William Penn Honors Program does that through a special way, through a great books track core curriculum that you can take with any major at the university. So if you want to know more about honors and you're here as a prospective student or family, I'll be here in the back with some of our interns to talk to you about it. There's brochures, so don't miss that opportunity to have a chocolate-covered pretzel and talk about great books with us. But without further ado, I want to introduce our speaker. Dr. Noah Toly is the Executive Director of the Center for Urban Engagement and also Professor of Urban Studies, Politics, and International Relations at Wheaton College, my alma mater in Illinois. He's the founding director of Wheaton's Equitas program in urban leadership, which is a really cool honors but non-honors program because they don't want to have honors programs at Wheaton, I guess. But through reading the great texts and having experiences together in Chicago, in the city, and around the world, they reflect on what it means to think about a thriving city and to be a leader in it as a Christian in the 21st century. And it's just a fantastic program. Learned a lot from Noah on that front. He's written many things, books and articles, but most recently, The Gardener's Dirty Hands, Environmental Politics and Christian Ethics, out with Oxford University last year, that we'll hear more about this evening. He's a senior fellow at the University of Chicago's Martin Marty Center. He's a visiting scholar and will be a visiting fellow next year at Duke Divinity School in Durham. Introducing these kinds of people, you just kind of get tired of all their accolades at some point, and you're just like, who cares? He's smart. We know it. So I'll just turn to say this, that a couple things. One is, I, growing up in an evangelical Christian context, didn't really clearly understand my own responsibility and connection to the environment. And I'm not totally sure why that was, but for many of us, if you grow up in a certain Christian context, there's almost like an antagonism between the spiritual and the material realm. It's like a dualism or something. Or maybe it's an antagonism to this world and this age and the next world that we're going to have after the apocalypse or something like that, when this world dissolves. And so there's almost this sense of, who cares? It's all going to burn anyways. And fortunately, by God's grace, I've learned more and actually started reading the Bible again and saw that creation is really important in the Bible and that Christians have a responsibility to care for it even as it connects to the new creation. But for me, that sense of obligation for creation has mostly manifested in wearing Patagonia clothes and driving a Prius and fighting for clean rivers in the state so I can catch steelhead with my fly rod. And Noah's work has helped me recognize that at the heart of our concern for creation is our love for neighbors, because the way we use or abuse the natural world has direct impact on the lives of others, especially the lives of those vulnerable and those on the margin. And it's that connection between beauty and justice that his work really nicely points out. It's great, too, how his work appeals to figures like Bonhoeffer and Greek tragedians like Aeschylus as a way of thinking about our moral choices in an age of environmental complexity. And more than that, Noah's work helps me see that we're living in an age of a false divide as Christians. There seems to be one camp that's concerned about the individual person and holiness and salvation, and then this other camp that says all they care about is changing the world and justice out there. But the heart of the gospel is that God's justice touches the individual soul as much as it touches our societies, our cities, and this world, including our relationship to nature. So it's a real pleasure and privilege to have Dr. Toly with us tonight. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you. Good to have you. Well, good evening, and thank you, Joseph, for that kind introduction. I'll just make 3 comments before I even proceed with what I have written down here. And one of them is that after an introduction like that, I don't think I need to say much more. There's so much in how Joseph just ended those last few comments about our care for the environment, our engagement in the environment, why we may have been distant from that for a long time, and how we can come to recognize our responsibility to it. We could just skip to Q&A. My second point is that please do. He said to keep in mind good questions along the way and bring good questions at the end. Please do that. That's my favorite part of this whole thing. The rest of it is me hearing myself talk, at least for me. You've not heard me talk before, but I've heard this before. I want to hear your great questions and have some stimulating conversation at the end. And the third thing is that the best part is already behind us. Literally, the title, it's all downhill from there. The Gardener's Dirty Hands captures pretty well what we're up to tonight, and I'll explain a bit of how that works, and then hopefully we'll tee up a really good conversation. It's been a wonderful day, by the way, here in Newburgh, and I'm grateful for the hospitality that so many have shown, and for the chance to reconnect with old friends and a chance to learn from what George Fox is doing in so many important areas. I'm honored to be part of a lecture series with so many distinguished speakers, and I want to thank Joseph in particular for the invitation tonight. The conversations about this visit actually began at Wheaton when Dr. Clare was there giving an outstanding talk on Augustine and also putting on a terrific professional development seminar for faculty involved in our general education program. Dr. Clare talked about effective seminar teaching, including preparing students to engage in a style of learning that may be new for them. And I've kept and revisited my notes from that session. I'm a note taker, but I'm not always a note keeper or a note revisitor. Writing it down generally helps me the first time around, but these ones I've gone back to a few times, and it was very helpful to me over the past couple years. So my opportunity to sit in today on a seminar, some of you were in earlier, with Drs. Johansson and Jolliffe, was another great opportunity to learn, and as was my time with Dr. Favali, too, later on in discussion about the honors program. And the students who showed up for a lunch roundtable today gave me a chance, with their terrific questions, to see the impact that the honors program has directly, and I really appreciated that. So all of that is to say that I hope tonight to do one modest thing, which is simply to repay all of that favor in some small way. The title of this evening's talk is The Gardener's Dirty Hands, Environmental Politics and Christian Ethics, which happens to be the title of my recent book. As the slide earlier, when you were all sitting down, showed, you can get that on Amazon, on Kindle or in hardcover, and Amazon has recently dropped the price. And so I'm not exactly going to walk you through the book, because if you wanted that, you could pick it up. But rather, I'm going to demonstrate for you how I came to the conclusions in the book. I'm going to show you some of the revelations, recognitions, realizations that happened along the way, and shaped what that book became, that led to the book. And we'll dig deeper on a few points that I think you may find especially interesting, highlight for this audience what is merely a footnote in the book, and then look to the future, our future, and briefly conclude with some implications for all of us. So let's begin with the first and second realizations that I came to that more or less drove the argument behind the book as it emerged. The first realization is embarrassingly basic for an academic. So I'm going now to confess to you that there's something that I think is more or less obvious that I should have gotten before I did, and then I had an aha moment or a light bulb moment. I was a student in a program in urban affairs and public policy, studying community economic development, and alongside me, and I was working in community economic development as well in Wilmington, Delaware, and alongside me were students in another concentration in energy and environmental policy. And I looked over at that other concentration and wondered what it was doing in a program in urban affairs and public policy. Why do we have an energy and environmental policy concentration here? I understood fully why we had a community economic development program, but why energy and environment? It wasn't long before I was disabused of what was essentially my facile dichotomy, my facile dualism between nature and culture, between environment and society. What happened was that I was brutally awakened to the entanglement of these things when all of the communities that we were working in to do community economic development, it seemed, were plagued by brownfields. And some of you probably know what brownfields are. Many of you probably do. The EPA definition of brownfield is a site that is contaminated, or where real or perceived contamination, soil contamination generally, complicates development or redevelopment efforts. So where real or perceived soil contamination complicates development or redevelopment efforts. 40% of Wilmington, Delaware's unused or underutilized tax parcels, which are sort of key to some community development efforts, vacant lots, things you can do lots of things with them, and if you don't, they're not contributing to the vitality of the neighborhood. 40% of these were brownfields. Almost all of those were in low-income communities. Almost all of those low-income communities plagued by brownfields were predominantly non-white in their population. So all of the places where we were trying to do community economic development work were facing this environmental challenge. So there I was sitting wondering what environment and energy had to do with urban affairs and public policy, while the communities we were working in weren't wondering that at all. They were wondering why their fate was somehow determined by environmental history that had nothing to do with them, but everything to do with the past shipyards, tanneries, chemical plants that had populated and pocked those neighborhoods in the past. They knew well what it took me a long time to conclude. And so I was quickly disabused of this very basic and very wrong dichotomy. Many others have done a wonderful job of exploring this, none better than the environmental historian William Cronin. So I recommend to you all of his books, including Nature's Metropolis, Chicago and the Great West, which is perhaps the greatest environmental history ever written, and one that not only does the work of disabusing us of this nature, culture, environment, society dichotomy, but also the urban-rural piece, too. And more, I think we need to add that to this mix. Shortly after that, I decided to go into work right at this intersection, working on environmental justice issues specifically in cities. And a few years later, I ended up interviewing for the job I currently hold, had a different shape, but the job I currently hold at Wheaton College in 2006. I gave, after a long class session, they made me actually teach a 3.5-hour class during my interview. At the end of this class session, I gave a talk on Wilmington's proposed zero brownfields future. Policymakers, activists and others in Wilmington had gotten together, thought long and hard about this problem that I just spoke about, and they came up with at least a name for an initiative and some of the basic contours of it. We're going to address all of the brownfields in Wilmington. We want a zero brownfields future. So I concluded on this note after speaking about environmental justice issues in the city during this interview. We took some questions, the kinds of really great questions I hope you have later. And at the end, when we thought we were done with the questions, I was just about to turn and walk away from the front when one more hand went up in the back. It was a member of the search committee, which was actually incredibly daunting. And it was this economist who was participating in the discussions all day, really had been interesting interlocutor. And he said, I have a question for you. Why would you want to remediate all of the brownfields? And I gave him this really perplexed look. I'm not very good at hiding how I feel about things. I don't have a great poker face. It's something I always want to get better at. So I gave him this obviously perplexed look. And then I said, what do you mean? Can you explain your question? And he said, well, some of the brownfields will be really cheap. They'll be easy to remediate. They're inexpensive. You should remediate those. But some of them will be really expensive. They'll be costly to remediate. It may not be the most efficient use of those funds to put them to use remediating those costly brownfields. That money could be used for nutrition, public health, education, a lot of other things that are good for those neighborhoods. And note, by the way, that he wasn't saying that money could be put to use for trivial things. That money could be put to use for someone else's luxuries. He was saying that money could be put to use for other things that are really good for that neighborhood. Now, I think I was a little bit threatened by the question. Maybe it was the moment, but I think it was also the question. And my initial response was this. I said, if I'm a policymaker, I'm not going to walk into one neighborhood and say, good news, we're remediating your brownfields. Your kids don't have to play near the polluted sites anymore. And we're going to build affordable housing on these sites. And walk into the other neighborhood and say, I'm sorry, we're not remediating your brownfields. We're giving you a couple extra bucks for education, but your kids still have to play near these polluted sites. That's what I said. And you can probably tell there that, A, that's an appeal to equity. Right? He was appealing to efficiency. I was appealing to equity. But also it was super self-centered. I was speaking as a policymaker who didn't want to deal with the tension. My immediate response was, how would I do that if I were an elected official or an appointed official who didn't want to deal with the discrepancy between those two neighborhoods? But more importantly, the question and the answer both highlighted the fact that there were no self-justifying options in the conversation. The question highlighted this, and my questioner highlighted this by saying, it's not actually a self-justifying option, this is the implication of what he said, to spend all that money on the brownfields. Because the alternatives include lots of good things you could spend the money on and you will forego. Those are the costs, and you've got to deal with it. And the other options there aren't self-justifying either. If you say I'm not doing the brownfields because I'm giving more money to the schools and the public health initiatives and the nutrition initiatives, that's not self-justifying either. You're still foregoing some other good. And more deeply than that, there's actually a built-in non-self-justifying aspect of the trade-off between efficiency and equity. That is, we can't have both of them, right? If we go with his option, we can balance them, but you're still giving up something. If we go with his option, we get efficiency and we give up equity. And if we go with my option, we get equity and we give up efficiency. So even in the conversation about which principles will drive the decision, this trade-off is pretty clear. And this stuck with me. This, I would say, more than stuck with me. It sort of haunted me. I don't think I've ever been haunted by a question the way that that question haunted me. And I think there are lots of reasons for that. I think, number one, all of us resist the notion that there's no self-justifying option. We're inclined to resist that. And I'm no different. I'm inclined to resist it. But also, it fights against every way of dealing with environmental ethics, environmental politics that I knew. And I had a pretty sophisticated toolkit for dealing with these things. But in some ways, it was sophisticated and sort of blind to this problem. And so it became part of my teaching agenda. I would put questions to students in my course about Chicago or my course on environmental politics having to do with energy, specifically. I'd say, well, do you know where our energy comes from around here? And in some ways, yes, that's a problematic question. It all goes in the grid, and it all comes from all the places, right? But in some ways, that's not totally accurate because there's enough loss on the line and there's enough loss between the place of generation and the place of consumption that you're really consuming more of the energy that's produced near you. So I said, where are we producing energy nearby? How do we do it? And they'd do some exploration. They'd find out that nearby in Illinois, we produce a lot of nuclear energy. We produce a lot of coal-fired energy, coal-generated energy. I said, good. Where are those coal-fired power plants, the nearest ones? And they would do some research, and they'd find out that there were two nearby. Both of them in Chicago, both in low-income neighborhoods on the west side of the city, operating for 80 and 100 years respectively, in neighborhoods that, because of ethnic transition over time, had been low income for a very long time, but had become neighborhoods populated almost exclusively by people of color. And I'd say, okay, so good. So what do we get from that? What do we get from that here in Wheaton? And the answer was easy. This was super easy. We get cheap electricity, right? That's the easy answer. We shovel coal in, we get cheap electricity here in Wheaton. Good. What do they get there? In the neighborhoods where these plants are operating? Jobs? Nope. Actually, by some records, no one employed at either of those sites was ever from the neighborhoods in which those plants operated. Do they get cheap electricity? Sure, but they don't consume it like we do in the western suburbs. They get asthma. They die early deaths. A Harvard study showed that over time, hundreds and hundreds of people had died prematurely because of these two power plants. Thousands of pulmonary disease cases because of these two power plants. And that was not shared equitably. That's not something that we also got in Wheaton. We didn't get that. We got the cheap electricity and we kept the asthma at bay. They didn't get much cheap electricity, they didn't get any jobs, and they got a lot of asthma. And I said, okay, what do we do with our electricity? Well, we refrigerate medicine. That's really good. Refrigerating medicine is a huge advance over when we could not refrigerate medicine. We have classes at night and before the sun comes up in the morning. That's really good. In all parts of the world, for a long time, one of the main ways people have improved their lots is actually by studying when the sun is down, because they're working when the sun is up. That's good. We get to see far off stars and planets in our powered telescope and learn about these amazing things God has made. Okay, that's good. We run our Jumbotron for the football games. I played football, so nothing against football, but we do that with the power. And we light our mastodon, which is our unofficial mascot, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Those are the things that we do with our electricity. Some of them are really good. Some of them are sort of trivial or luxurious. That's what we do with our cheap electricity. So I had students discuss what would we do about this? And initially they wanted to trot out answers that would get us past these trade-offs. They wanted us to come to conclusions that there were interventions that would involve no costs, no meaningful costs. And we couldn't find any. I'm a big fan of investing in renewable energy. We landed on that. But that has costs. And the investments there, especially over the past half century in research and development, actually are investments you could have put elsewhere, like my economist friend pointed out. Could have done a lot of things with that money. There are things we've foregone in order to come to those options. And we need to remind ourselves of that. There are no self-justifying options. Most of us experience this, we feel it, as if we can't do anything right. Our typical responses to that are anxiety, denial, paralysis, nihilism, and moral skepticism. So we get anxious because we can't find the one right answer, or we can't find the answer that involves no trade-off, no cost. We are in denial because we just don't like that. We say, it's not really like that. That's not how the world is. Those are not what my options are. I'm in denial about that. That would be like me giving the equity answer and then saying game over. I called equity on you, and that's the trump card. There's no cost to that. But it's not true. Paralysis, facing these things and saying, I'm just paralyzed by the fact that all these things have costs. I'm paralyzed by the trade-offs, by the recognition. Nihilism, it's meaningless then. If I can't find the one right answer that's self-justifying, gets me off the hook, it means nothing. Life means nothing. Or moral skepticism, then we can't possibly know. You're telling me we can't possibly know. Those are the typical reactions we have to this sense that we can't do anything right when it comes to environmental politics. It is that no matter what we do, we must sacrifice some good thing. If we're honest with ourselves, most of us experience environmental politics, policy, and governance, and sometimes our individual interactions with environmental issues as almost a problem of dirty hands. No matter what we do, the choice we make, we bear some guilt. We can turn brownfields into gardens, but the gardeners will have dirty hands. Those are the first two recognitions. The third recognition I owe to Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I was in a class on Bonhoeffer's theology, his ethics. We were reading through his ethics. And there is this wonderful essay, History and the Good One, is what it's called. And in it, he cites the Greek tragedian poet Aeschylus. He cites something that Orestes, the main character in Aeschylus' trilogy, the Oresteia, says in the second book of that trilogy, the Libation Bearers. For those of you who know the Libation Bearers and its story, Orestes comes home, finds out that his mother has killed his father, which is a problem. And there are lots of reasons that his mother has killed his father. I think I mentioned earlier to the roundtable students that it's complicated. Basically, Orestes' father has sacrificed their daughter, so his mother was angry about this. But also his mother wanted a role in ruling the city together with somebody else, and therefore killed her husband in order to get him out of the way. So Orestes is charged with, he's responsible for avenging his father's murder. But this is matricide, right? Zeus expects him to avenge his father's murder, not to leave this offense unavenged. On the other hand, if he kills his mother, the Furies, pictured here, will track him down. This is actually supposed to be Orestes. The Furies will track him down. And he cries out, right collides with right. Right collides with right. The chorus responds with, But still some God, if he desires, may work these strains into a song of joy. That's the chorus's response. And then urges him to act. Without necessarily saying what that action would be, but just urges him to act. And he does kill his mother to avenge his father, and then he runs off trying to get away from the Furies. Runs to Athens, where Athena, the goddess, interesting twist there, still some goddess if she desires, Athena puts on a tribunal of 12 citizens who are supposed to weigh Orestes' deed. And they split 6 and 6. So even they can't figure this out, right? This is just reinforcing the kind of situation that he was in, that they split 6 and 6. And Athena strikes a deal with the Furies to change their names if they'll let him off the hook. And that's how it goes. So the goddess has worked this thing out for him. But he had no self-justifying option. Both of the options would trade off one good in order to have another good. And Bonhoeffer described this as the definitive context for responsible action. We can't tonight get into all the things that I've learned Bonhoeffer means by responsible action, but suffice it to say that it's actually related to his concept of justification, which is informed by what he calls Stellvertretung, which means vicarious representative action, the kind of action that Jesus took on our behalf, so that he vicariously and representatively took on the costs of active obedience and suffering as well, so that we could benefit. And this got me thinking. This right colliding with right thing sounded familiar to me. It sounded familiar because it had been haunting me since 2006. And I began to wonder, does the Christian tradition give us language for this? Are there people who stand in this tradition who can help with this? What would it look like to draw upon Scripture and others who stand in that tradition? And would they give us something different from anxiety, denial, paralysis, nihilism, skepticism? So I spent some time looking into this. I drew chiefly on Bonhoeffer, but also on Paul Ricoeur and on Edward Farley, a Protestant theologian from the late 20th century, who both give a lot of attention to what they call the tragic. And we'll actually say some of the things we don't mean by the tragic first. We don't mean a fall from grace. We don't mean a bad outcome, even. And that's important, and I'll come back around to that. We don't mean a bad outcome. What we mean is the need to give up, undermine, destroy, or forego one or more goods in order to possess or secure one or more other goods. This is characterized, as Ricoeur puts it, by a sense of ineluctable guilt. That is, no matter what you do, you carry the guilt of having given up, foregone, destroyed, or undermined one or more goods to have one or more others. Farley says that it's a basic corollary of finitude. He actually describes it as the most basic feature of the human condition. What he means by it being a basic corollary of finitude is we're finite, discrete beings who can't be in two places at once. This is not all he means by it, but this is the most basic thing he would mean by it. I can't be here tonight and also at my 10-year-old's first basketball game tonight. That happened today, right? So I could be there and forego this, or I could be here and forego that. I'll hear later from my wife how it went. I don't know what the story was, but I hope Rose scored a few baskets and felt like she was improving as a player. But I didn't get to see it. There are things that because of our finitude we can't do, because we can only do one of those things in one given place at one given time. So it's a basic corollary of finitude. And we can respond to the tragic in ways that Farley describes as subjugating or liberating. which is we respond to it by pushing its costs onto others so that we can benefit. That's subjugating. Or we respond to it by bearing costs so that others can benefit. And that's liberating. And we also create social systems that enable one or the other of those things, or both of them in some balance, to go on, that over time are sedimented and difficult to change. We can see that the tragic, defined in this way, is actually also a chief preoccupation of modern environmental thought and global environmental governance. I'd actually argue that it is the chief preoccupation of modern environmental thought and global environmental governance, but we don't have time to make the argument that it's the tonight. So we'll just make the argument that it's a, or I'll show you how I make it. I think that it's symbolized in scarcity, tragedy, and risk. Scarcity, tragedy, and risk are three main symbols, three main concepts in modern environmental thought and global environmental governance. Scarcity is of two sorts, relative or absolute. Relative scarcity is the relatively high number of ends we have, or goals we have, things we want to do, compared to the means that we have to do those things. Absolute scarcity is, I'm going to run out of that thing someday. Right? Someday we will run out of that resource, or we'll run out of that space to put our trash, or whatever it is. You can see there that that involves some trade-offs, especially relative scarcity, which the economists have cornered the market on, has actually captured scarcity really well. Trade-offs really well, the tragic really well, right? You can't necessarily accomplish all your ends with your limited means. Tragedy, like the tragedy of the commons, is in some ways about just a bad outcome. That's the shallow tragedy of the commons. But the tragedy of the commons is also about a deeper sort of tragedy. Original articles about the tragedy of the commons, like Garrett Hardin's 1968 article on the topic, which was the seminal article on the topic, actually talked about the inexorable decline of the commons unless we put fetters on people's freedom. And so there you see the tragic nature of the tragedy of the commons, right? There you see that we can either have the freedom or we can have the environmental integrity, but we can't have them both. Pick, you're good. Give up the other to some extent. And risk is a measure of how likely it is that we'll actually have a bad outcome based on the steps that we'll take. Who is likely to suffer it, whether the actual bad outcome is really likely to happen often, high frequency, or low frequency, or whether it's high stakes, whether it's actually massively destructive or only a little bit destructive, whether it's destructive over time or destructive all at once, cataclysmically. But risk is about how we deal with the fact that we're going to get one good thing if we do this, but we may have this bad thing come back and bite us in the end. All those things belong to the tragic, and they belong to modern environmental thought and global environmental governance. I looked at biblical sources. I think the story of creation attests to the goodness of the tragic, as a matter of fact, the goodness of finitude at least. God created a finite creation, finite people in it. They couldn't do every good thing at once, and he over and over said this is good as he created this finite creation. Same world that God said was good overflows with good things. The cup runs over, right? I don't know about you, but when my cup runs over, I don't get that stuff. When my cup runs over, the stuff that spills around, I don't get to consume. It's something given up. It's this superabundance that I can't possibly even capture. Jesus did not do all the good things that he could have done. And I don't think that this aspect of our creation is one that we ought to expect goes away in the new creation. It's a picture of communion for a reason. If you stand in much of the Protestant tradition, not all of it, but much of it, you stand in a tradition that rejected certain ways of thinking about communion, specifically transubstantiation, that the bread and wine become the body and the blood, and consubstantiation, that the bread and the wine are present really in, with, and under the body and the blood are present in, with, and under the bread and the wine. Rejected that on account of the fact that Jesus is really raised bodily in something that looks like this-ish, not a sport coat, but like one of our bodies, and that he can't be really raised and present, seated at the right hand of the Father, and also right here in my hand. And what those reformers thought they were doing was affirming God's good creation. And what they were also doing was saying that this part of the good creation lasts into the new creation, lasts past resurrection. All of a sudden you get resurrected doesn't mean you're going to be in two places at once. It means that this aspect of finitude sticks with us. Now I want to look toward the future, our future. A few comments on the Anthropocene before closing up with some implications for how we live. The Anthropocene, as most of you probably know, is the geological epoch that we're just entering and naming now. And it is so named because human activity is now regarded as the most important dynamic shaping the face of the earth. Geologists have been debating for a long time when we should actually agree that this is a new geological epoch. They recently agreed that it is. Then they had to decide when it would start, when they would drive what they call a golden spike in history that marks the beginning of the Anthropocene. They chose the first nuclear tests in the New Mexico desert. They had a lot of options, but they chose the first. They had the Columbian Exchange as an option, so when two hemispheres started exchanging all sorts of diseases and plants and animals, they had climate change as an option, but they chose nuclear testing as the moment after which we know that the human fingerprint is an indelible fingerprint on the face of the earth. There have been lots of responses to this. It makes a lot of people anxious. A lot of people want to go back to some pristine environment. I don't think that's possible. There's been a debate about the good Anthropocene or the bad Anthropocene. What would a bad future be like? Can we make a good one? If we're going to make it, can we make a good future? I don't think those are the right conversations. In fact, I don't think it's right to talk about the good Anthropocene if we mean self-justifying Anthropocene at all. In fact, I'd describe that as an impossibility theorem. It's a bit like Dietrich Bonhoeffer's ethics begins with the assumption that Christian ethics is not about being good because he doesn't think people can be. Right? I don't think that the ethics of the Anthropocene is about being good if what we mean is justifying oneself, justifying the one Anthropocene we end up with. But what we will have inevitably is the tragic Anthropocene. Paul Tillich describes the tragic as the need to forego certain ways of organizing our lives in favor of other ways, certain possible lives in favor of other ways. And that is what the Anthropocene will necessarily involve. There's an incredibly large number, I'm tempted to say infinite, but it all depends on how detailed we get in parsing the possibilities, of bad ways to shape the future of the planet. And there's also a plurality of potentially legitimate, even if not self-justifying, ways to shape the future of the planet. We will only live in one of those worlds. I don't mean bad or good. I mean, even if good, we will only live in one of the good options. Not sort of a multiverse future, not a multi-Anthropocene. We will live in one. And any one that we experience involves giving up, undermining, foregoing, or destroying the possibilities of the others, not living in them. And this makes the Anthropocene a necessarily and inevitably tragic epoch. So one of the tools for living in the Anthropocene will be an understanding of the tragic. I might even say a certain comfort level with discussion of the tragic, with the ethics that attach to admitting that we live in the midst of that. So what are a couple of the upshots and how should we respond? This photo was taken by a colleague of mine in Washington, Illinois after an EF4, nearly EF5 tornado. So we're talking about a tornado among the most powerful ever to have touched down in the U.S. Destroyed the town. And the dining room table you see set up in the midst of the destruction was set up by Wheaton students who went down there, found the dining room table as they were helping to clean up, and set it up so that people would have some place to eat together while they were there. In some ways, I think this is a picture of how we ought to be responding to the tragic. And I'll give you 4 points. I think it's 4 points I've written here that help us get there. When we face the tragic, we can be free from denial, paralysis, nihilism, and skepticism, and free to act despite the fact that we cannot justify ourselves, despite the fact that there is no self-justifying choice available to us, because still some God, if he desired, because he desired, had worked these strains into a song of joy, which is to say, someone else has done the justifying work for us. When I feel guilty or am guilty of choosing something and foregoing, destroying, undermining, giving up one good in order to have those things, it's not my own better choice the next time or my avoiding the choice the first time around that justifies me. It's the work of Jesus Christ that frees me to act. So we should all be, in some ways, the chorus for one another as we're facing these anxieties, reminding each other that still some God, if he desires, will work these strains into a song of joy. The second thing to think about here is moral pluralism. There are indeed bad choices we can make in the face of the tragic. All of the choices that involve me accumulating goods for myself while I push costs off onto you, or future generations, voiceless communities, and vulnerable ecosystems, those are bad. Those are bad ways to face the tragic. But there's a plurality of potentially legitimate, even if not self-justifying ways. And in that plurality, there's sort of a built-in moral pluralism. There's a lot of options in that box, and we can all disagree on which of those we prefer. We work that out with each other. And it can be a source of our creativity, too, to consider this great range of possibilities. Third point is it's actually there's something about discipleship that we need to pay attention to here. There's something about following after Jesus that we need to pay attention to. That is, he is one who bore the cost so that others could benefit. And when we face the tragic, that model that he is for us is no small thing. When we face these choices, it is not only that he justified us so that we're free to act, but that he freed us specifically to act like he did, which is to bear costs so that others can benefit. And the final note that I'll end on is a question about hope. I've gotten this question 2 or 3 times in one form or another over the past couple days, and it's come up before. And I think it's a good note to end on. A lot of people have said, oh, this is dark. This is really hard. And it is. It's super hard. It's one of the hardest things that I've had to come to acknowledge. I would love to be wrong. So if you all just prove me wrong, that's great too, because then I will have new light in my life. But I think the hope doesn't come from some expectation that one day, whether that's tomorrow or in the new creation, God will somehow deliver us from the realities of finitude, limitation, the tragic, and we'll transcend all these things. That's not hope. In fact, that's false hope, if we have it. The hope is that one day God will transform our judgment so that we see the beauty of our limitations and transform our ethics, transform our wills so that we do, in the face of our limitations, the good things, which are to bear costs so that others may benefit, to do things that demonstrate we're for God, for others, and for creation, rather than for ourselves. One day, that's what God will do. Not make us able to be in 5 places at once. Make us satisfied with being in one. And give us a posture in that one place that is for Him, for neighbor, and for the world. And the Holy Spirit, hopefully, is doing that little by little every day, even before then. Unfortunately, not with steady progress necessarily in my life, but little by little, even if haltingly. That's what hope would mean in the face of the tragic. Thank you.
Promised it's Q&A time, and I hope you're ready. We like to give the first question to an undergrad or a high school student if you're present with us, so don't be shy. I see one there. We'll give you a mic from Claire so we can capture it.
Well, so that's a good question because you said more. Should we be focusing more? So you're not posing that question as a dichotomy. It's not one or the other. So normally I would respond and say it can be both, but you asked me which should be more. I do think that in some ways depends on our position and role in life, the networks that we have, the calling that God has given us. Some people are not able to focus on policy change. Some people don't have that option. They may actually be part of some actually marginalized, voiceless community. And one thing I don't want to do is push off on that community all the responsibility for making the individual change that really rightly belongs more to me. If we get back to the Fisk and Crawford power plant examples, for example. But when they're considering that, when they're thinking about policy change, the answer often comes back, we don't have a voice in that. And so maybe the answer is individual change, neighborhood change, community change. So I think whatever it is, wherever it is that God has placed us, actually has some bearing on how we answer that question. So if you're called to policy or a network that affects how we think about shape culture vis-a-vis these environmental questions, do that. Because not everybody is equipped for that or positioned for that.
Great. Who else? Maybe I'll interject one while we're waiting. One thing people worry about most about Christians and Christian ethics is that our doctrine of sin makes us sort of callous about our moral responsibility in the world. As you were talking, I was picturing ripping through the landscape in a huge Dodge Ram diesel with sin boldly on my back bumper, right? So that's how some people perceive of Christians. It's the sense that all of our actions are sin-tinged in some way, and therefore you just got to start to deal with the guilt and make the decision. So I guess I would wonder, how would you correlate the concepts of sin and evil with this sense of the tragic decision making? And at what point does it become a kind of justification for these hard things that we have to do?
Great question. I think I've seen that truck before. Actually, I didn't know it was yours. So excuse me for the, funny look I gave you as I drove by. I think the concepts of sin and evil are really important here. The concept of idolatry can do a lot of work too. I actually had a whole section on that somehow well, I know why it didn't make it in. I haven't picked it back up again. Sin and evil, I think, have to do with how we respond to the tragic. They're not characteristics of the tragic. There are other ways to think about the tragic, most of them we're more familiar with, where sin and evil would have more to do with the tragic itself. But as I'm describing it, where we need to give up, undermine, destroy, or forego one or more goods to possess or secure one or more others, and this is a basic aspect of our finitude, and I couldn't be with Rose tonight for her basketball game. The questions of sin and evil come in when it has to do with how I respond to that. And when I submit to or indulge in the subjugating impulse of pushing costs off onto future generations, voiceless communities, and vulnerable ecosystems so I can have benefits, that's evil. That's sinful. And when I respond to the tragic in such a way that I bear costs so that others may benefit, that's good. We can't always see the evil thing we're about to do, right? Or the fact that the thing we're about to do actually is subjugating. And there are a lot of good questions to explore and push on in that area. And that has to do with social systems that we use to try to overcome some of the costs of the tragic, but eventually have built in some costs, usually for others. And then what do we do and how do we invest in revising those social systems? Is a question we should ask.
Yeah, we'll go over there. Claire, can you? Oh, you have a question. How about Richard, and then you can go for it, Claire.
My question was on, is the mic working?
Yeah.
Okay, sweet. So humans work under incentives. You could even say you are here because your incentive to come here was greater than the incentive to see your daughter play basketball.
Don't tell her that.
I won't. Keep that secret. And you could and it could even be argued that Christians are incentivized to confront the tragic because it's a part of our belief structure, and there's trade-offs in this life for gains in the next, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and even gains in this life. So how would you say, honestly, how could non-Christians be incentivized to face the tragic?
That's a fantastic question. You are like my economist friend from my story. Are you an econ major? Yes, okay, I knew it. I had you picked out from the beginning. As soon as you said incentives. So I think this is really important, especially when it comes to revising those social systems. That we had just ended the previous question on essentially the tricky aspect of moving from the individual scale or the very small scale to very large scales. Not to say that incentives don't matter at smaller scales, but they really come into play when we're designing social systems at some larger scale. And I would argue that the right social system would have a few features in it if we were going to properly incentivize people to deal with this well, rather than subjugatingly. Number one, it would have a feedback loop from wherever the costs and benefits land to those people who are making the decisions. We would all know the costs and benefits. We would understand that information really well. We don't understand that really well right now. As individuals, we don't understand it as policymakers. We may understand it better than we have before, but we really don't understand it that well. And we really, in some ways, don't want that feedback loop right now. So you have to have that to begin this process of doing that well. Secondly, it would effectively allow no negative externalities. You would not allow that. You'd have to include negative externalities as prices paid by the people generating them rather than the price paid by people bearing them. And you wouldn't allow people to actually push the costs off in that way. And then finally, you would find a way to incentivize the hard part, which is getting people to bear costs so that others benefit. That has probably more to do with cultural incentives than with monetary or financial incentives. And you can't get there, I don't think, until you've taken those first two steps, because you don't even know how others would benefit if you bear costs, if you don't have that feedback loop. And you're really not accustomed to thinking this way if you're allowing all sorts of negative externalities. This does get tricky, though, in terms of how we govern ourselves, because not everybody agrees with this, and so how do you come to the conclusion that you're going to implement something like this? There have been real extremists on this account. Some people who are in the social ecology world have been real extremists on this account. The philosopher Hans Jonas is really has an interesting and relatively extreme statement in an essay about this. Jonas, I think, if I have this right, was a student of Martin Heidegger's, who proved to be a Nazi. Jonas was a German Jew whose family suffered through and some barely escaped the Holocaust. And Jonas has this collection of essays called Mortality and Morality After Auschwitz. In it, he has one that deals with some ecological questions. And he actually says that people who threaten the conditions for the conditions for the perpetuation of life on Earth, essentially, should be put in concentration camps. That's pretty extreme, and it's even more extreme when you recognize who said it, right? But that's how difficult some of the governance questions get. I'm not saying I agree with that, but I'm saying the conversation about how you talk about this together and come to a conclusion when you don't agree, and some people are driving the truck that says sin boldly, that's a really hard conversation that works very differently depending on what kind of government you have, too.
Blair.
Is this on? Yes. It's so weird. It feels like it's not. Okay. Yeah. So my question is every situation tragic or just like some of them? Because it seems like, yes, like there's some cases like, okay, do you repair the costly brownfield or do you like use that money to help the education of that community? Yeah, that seems like a tragic situation. But there are some situations where it seems like the right thing to do is much more clear cut. So are you saying that every situation is tragic and that humans are just like, born to live in this, or that just some of our decisions are tragic?
Unfortunately, I'm saying that all of them are. And I want to open up some space there. But I don't think there is space there once you define the tragic in this way, right? If you define the tragic as also a bad outcome, or you define the tragic as only non-trivial goods, and then you try to actually explore what is trivial and what is not trivial and define that, then you can create some light there. But if you define it the way we've defined it, then every situation is. By God's grace, He gives us, I think, moments in which we prematurely, and by that I mean, we have more of the already than the not yet. Before the consummation, our judgment is so sanctified in some moment or with regard to some issue, and our will is so sanctified that we find deep satisfaction and contentment in the way that we've resolved some tension or we've made some trade-off. I think we have that a lot. I think that we have that especially when we use community as our way to respond to the tragic rather than, say, technology. We have that in our families when we give things up for each other. We have that among our friends. But I don't think that means we're not really giving something up.
You gave a couple examples of tragedies like repairing the brownfields versus using that money for other things, or replacing the power plants with renewable energy instead of using that money for helping efforts that help the community directly. And maybe this is just me not understanding or having a good knowledge of how the renewable energy affects the communities, but one of those some of those options seem like long-term benefits. So like the fixing the brownfields or adding the renewable energy seem like long-term benefits that eliminate the tragedy for future generations, while the short-term options, like giving to the community directly, seem to kick the can down the road. Is there a way that the short-term efforts can eliminate the tragedy for future generations?
I wouldn't say eliminate. I mean, what we can do is we can do some work on these subjugating systems, and what they can do is not eliminate tragedy, but they can reduce subjugation. They can reduce the ways in which our social systems promote, incentivize, enable a subjugating impulse, or allow some hidden subjugation to just go on. But I don't think they eliminate or reduce the reality of the tragic. And I'll add another piece that may not be getting at what you're talking about, although it might, given the example you went to with the power plants and the renewable energy. What our students typically did, I sort of skimmed over this as I was telling you that story, but they typically went through options like, oh, we can build tiny little coal-fired power plants in everybody's backyard, and then they'll have their power and they'll have their costs right there at the same time. That's not really feasible, and in some ways it would be a lot worse. Because when we build the tiny ones, they actually perform worse in this way. So it'd be like all of us being over smoky cook stoves, which in some parts of the world are an awful scourge, especially for people who are cooking in the home. Right? So we don't want to do that. And then they'd say, okay, so we'll do renewable energy, and that comes with some costs, especially in R&D, right? But then what we talked about is, not here, but there in class, what finally happened with those power plants. So what finally happened was they were finally shut down. They were shut down because of decades of activism on the part of El Vejo, Little Village Environmental Justice Organization. Also, the contributions of 2 Northwestern University law school students who gave their services pro bono to the community to come alongside them. Also, a new alderman was elected. So it needed all these things from the grassroots all the way up to the mayor's office and the C-suite and elite universities. Don't let anybody tell you social change only happens one way. Usually it takes all these things at once. And then it changed and the power plants were shut down because of real legislation and also some threatened legislation that didn't happen but was enough to shut them down. But when they shut down, hundreds of people lost their jobs. Many of them were too old to go on and get another job. Many of them remained unemployed. And it happened right before the Great Recession. And we know what impacts psychologically, emotionally on a person and their family long-term unemployment has, even to the point, and I'm not saying this happened with people who were affiliated with those 2 power plants, I don't know, but even to the point where some people take their lives because of the pressure of it. And so even when we say that the power plants were shut down, and even if there's some good to celebrate that came with it, there's a dramatic cost that most of us don't hear about.
Question that I want to throw your way. On Sunday evenings, I take out the trash, and I've noticed this feeling. When I walk down our long driveway on one Sunday, I only have the garbage, and I just think the whole time what a horrible person I am about how much garbage I put out. It's so heavy to carry this thing down our driveway. But then the next Sunday, I have the recycling and the garbage, and I think, man, I'm not such a bad person. And whatever's bad about this one trash can, I'm making up for with this recycling. And it just, as you were talking about, we live in a world with scarcity, with mortality, with these important trade-offs that we do. In what ways would you say environmentalism in a secular age has replaced religious practice in ways that we want to cleanse our conscience and cleanse ourselves of guilt?
A lot of people have explored that possibility. There's a lot of good writing on that topic, and it's worth reading. I think for many people, the practices associated with environmentalism have replaced some of the practices that we normally associate with religions like Christianity or Islam or Buddhism or Hinduism, any of the great world religions, Judaism. What I'm a little bit wary of, and I'm not saying you're trying to do this, but in a lot of conversations about that, people use that as a way to dismiss environmentalism. See, it is nothing more than a replacement for the religion that we know is true. And that's not accurate. In fact, I think it's pretty far from the truth, and I think arguments that pursue that angle are all dead wrong. But I do think that there are elements of it that for some people have replaced the practices of religion.
Sure. That's good. We'll take one more question from this gentleman.
It's a bit ironic that you just went there, because my question centered around your discussion of hope. I'm a little bit wary of how Christians can work with the secular community if we define hope only in one of two ways. If we say, as Christians are prone to do, our hope is in eternity and an afterlife, or if we say our hope is only in us becoming better while we're alive on the planet. That the second one is likely to turn off some of the Christian community, whereas the former is likely to turn off some of the secular community. What I want just to ask your thoughts on is integrating Christian and secular energy, activity, motion, getting people over those humps so that they will work with each other without questioning the motives, without even caring about the motives, because we're going for a good thing.
That's such a great question, and it won't surprise you that I have a sad and dark answer to that too. And here's what I mean by that. I'll tell one quick story, but then I'll answer this question from the only perspective that I really know and trust on it. And I'll give you the problems with that answer as well. So I've been dealing with that question with regard to this book and this argument since I was drafting it. And somebody said, well, are you addressing just Christians with this book? Are you trying to address others and get them to buy the argument? How will you do that if you're trying to do that? I said, no, I think I'm operating in a mode where if I have a non-Christian reader, I want them to understand how I might make this Christian argument. I'm not necessarily asking them to buy all of this argument themselves. That'd be a very different book, and I'm not sure I can do that. There might be someone who can do that, and that would be awesome, but I don't know if I can do that. So that's sort of my approach. My general approach to the question you asked is informed primarily by the French theologian and social theorist Jacques Ellul. Ellul, I think, sort of a genius. He's sort of a mad genius. There are all sorts of things that he says that are crazy and off the wall. He needed an editor, but every time he says something, even one that I disagree with, he prompts me with new questions that I have to wrestle with. He's got this great essay called Christian Faith and Social Reality that appears in a collection of essays called Sources and Trajectories, 8 early articles by Jacques Ellul that set the stage. And in it, he says that Christians have two main responsibilities. One of them is to build bridges with each other and to admit and to show others that what they have in common as Christians is more important than the differences between them that may be partisan or social or ethnic or something like that. And I think that's nicely Pauline, especially when I cited the ethnic point at the end. He also says that we build bridges with others. We show that we can participate in, essentially, he says, any party. But he says, at the same time, we should be smashing idols. We should always be smashing idols. And he says this in a bunch of other places too. And in The Meaning of the City, he calls this kind of work active pessimism. And by that, he means that we're active in all the things that our community partners and our parties do, and all the things that activists do and policymakers do. But we should not expect them to deliver on the soteriological significance that others invest them with. So others idolize these things, they're idolatrous, right, and think they're going to deliver us from everything. We should just go in and, he says, with good humor, go in and say, oh, I'm participating in this. This is great. I'm happy to be here. It's not going to do all the things you think it'll do, but I'm happy to be here and participate with you. That is really difficult. And he does say it's going to end up with two possibilities, miracle or martyrdom. And that's why I said this would be dark. Miracle is if I go and I work with people and I tell them, hey, I think you're idolizing this thing and it's not going to deliver you, but I'm happy to work on it with you for these small gains. And God somehow makes something of that. That's a miracle. Martyrdom is I say those things and I get kicked out. And nobody wants to play with me anymore. And it could be worse than that. That's why he calls it martyrdom. I actually think it's not quite as bad as Lowell puts it. This is the part where I have a reservation about what he says, because I think in God's ordinary providence, he actually makes a world in which sometimes that collaboration turns out good things without God's miraculous intervention. This is his ordinary providence and not his miraculous intervention. But still, I do believe we're called to desacralize things and tear down idols, and sometimes that gets in the way of really great collaboration. But we should try.
Dr. Toly said something at lunch to the students that really struck me, and that is we ought to think of all of our moral lives, including the moral part of us that interacts with environmental choices, in a Christ-like way, in a cross-shaped way. That is, we ought to think of taking and bearing costs so that others might benefit and flourish. And by doing that, it's not that we are saving ourselves or even the world, but we are participating by grace in the one who bore the ultimate costs so that the ultimate benefit could come to others. And I think that's a beautiful way to think about the way we share goods in this life, especially as they relate to the environment. So it's been a joy to have you, Dr. Toly. Please join me in thanking him one more time.
Good to be here.
And it's been a joy to have you all here. Thanks for joining us on this rainy Thursday. If you want to know more about honors and great books, I'd love to chat with you. And otherwise, we'll see you at another event this spring. Thank you.